This is Lupin Flour. The plant that this flour comes from is quite distinctive. I think it looks like quite large lavender sprigs. And whilst the plant itself is interesting, it is not as interesting as the seeds that come from it. The seeds of this plant are more commonly known as lupin beans. Lupin beans have been eaten in many places around the world for thousands of years. We can actually track the consumption of lupin beans in humans right back to the Romans in 700 BC. It's important to know that lupin beans are in the same family as peanuts and they are a legume. So if you have an allergy to peanuts or legume, you are very likely going to be allergic to lupin beans. But we're not here to talk about the lupin beans directly. We're here to talk about what happens when someone takes lupin beans and grinds them down. Hello my small fat adaptive family and welcome back to the Keto Kitchen. Today we're going to talk about lupin flour and how you can use it in ketosis. A few years ago I did a review on lupin flour, and whilst I do still think it's very beneficial information, in those last couple of years since that video I have learnt a lot and I feel like I've got a lot more information to add. Now if you Google lupin flour, you don't really see much in terms of recipes. You see more about sort of links of where to buy it. However, the interesting thing is, if you go over to the video section of the Google search engine, you will see not one, not two, not three, not four, but 5 of my recipes on the first page of Google. And that says a lot about lupin flour information when little old me with only, 8,000 subscribers is hogging up the first page of the biggest search engine in the world. So we know that lupin flour comes from the lupin bean of the lupin plant, but what is it like? Lupin flour is yellow. The intensity of this yellow will depend on manufacturer and how they process it. Texture-wise, it is very light and chalky, much like a high-carb all-purpose flour. In terms of smell, this heavily depends on the manufacturer again and how they process it. Some lupin brands people say have no smell, and others kind of say that it smells sort of like soybeans or tofu or other legumes. And taste, I'm going to outright say it, lupin flour is bitter. But this does depend heavily on the brand you are buying. Now there are 2 different variations of the lupin bean or the lupin flour. There is yellow, which is also known as bitter, and there is sweet. Now it is important to note that the sweet lupin is not actually sweet. It is just less bitter than the standard yellow or bitter lupin. The flour that I'm using today, which is from Hoosier Hill Farms, which is an American company, this lupin flour is sweet lupin flour, meaning it is less bitter than your standard yellow lupin. The first brand I tried, that French brand, was very bitter. That was yellow lupin. This brand, it still has a little bit of bitterness to it, but it's not hard to combat and it's not anywhere near as noticeable. This is not a food I recommend going whole hog into. When I first tried lupin flour, I used it in keto-friendly Yorkshire puddings, which was actually the reason I bought the flour. And I didn't notice any bitterness, but every recipe I made after that had some sort of bitterness. This is just something that I've had to countermeasure over time and experiment with different brands to find the least bitter one. Both types of lupin are really distinct in their nutrition. So lupin flour itself is about 40% protein, it's about 30% dietary fiber, and it's low in both fat and carbs. With such a low level of starches, with such a low level of glucose, it has a low glycemic index, it's gluten-free, and it also is a plant protein, so if you're vegan or vegetarian, it's acceptable for you. It's quite amazing that lupin flour isn't as well known with stats like this. I will say, however, lupin is one of those flours that has varying inflammation on person to person, so you just might want to be aware of that if you're prone to having inflammation with certain foods. Now I want to talk about the availability. Lupin flour is available worldwide, but good God, the prices vary. If you live in England with me, you can honestly be looking anywhere from about £8 to £22 for 500 grams. This cost me £13, I think it was, for a kilo, which is, to be honest, the best price I found for the best tasting lupin. There is a link to buy it on Amazon UK down below, but a full disclaimer, if you buy it via that link, I will get a small commission without you paying any extra money. So if you do that, you are directly supporting the channel, and thank you very much. If you live in America, you can get 500 grams of lupin flour for around about $5. If you live in Australia, you can get 500 grams of lupin flour for literally $5 Australian. And it really does vary like that all over the world, being cheaper towards the east, pretty expensive here in Europe, and sort of an okay price in the States. And it makes sense for prices to be like this because of where lupin is grown. I know that they're grown in the Americas, I know that they're grown in Africa, in the Mediterranean, in Australia, hot countries. Over here, the British summer feels like it lasts about a day. So we really can't get the right temperatures to grow good lupin beans, hence why it is so expensive in this country. When looking to buy lupin flour, it's one of them things that goes by multiple names. Lupin flour, sweet lupin flour, lupine flour, lupini flour, lupin, lupini and lupine protein powder. Like, this is advertised as a protein powder, but it is just lupin flour. And even the brand Miracle Flour in the US is actually lupin flour, which leads to a really good question. With the prices being so varied, can I make my own lupin flour like I do other nut flours? Honestly, I don't know whether it's worth doing it, because if I wanted to make something like almond flour, it is a really simple case of buying almonds and blending them into either a meal or just keep blending them into a fine flour. But because lupin beans are so high in alkaloid, meaning that if they're not prepared properly, not only do you get a horrendously bitter taste, you can also have symptoms like numbness in your limbs and fatigue and muscle spasms. They have to be prepared to prevent these things. And the preparation is not a 2-minute job. The preparation takes about 6 to 7 days. And it's a case of soaking them in water, draining them, simmering them in water, draining them, soaking them in salted 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 water, draining them. And you have to do that for like 6 to 7 days, and at that point they are ready to eat raw. It would mean that they have a high water content, which means that you can't just grind them into a flour. It would turn into a paste, so you'd probably have to dehydrate it, but I don't actually know how you do that because I have not been able to find anywhere an exact process to making lupin flour. Which leads me beautifully into how you can use lupin flour in your keto recipes. Replacing 20% of the almond flour with lupin flour in any keto recipe is a really good place to start. Not only does this help you see if the food is inflammatory to you, it also helps to see if the brand you have has any sort of bitter taste that you're going to have to counteract with sweetener. So if you have a recipe that calls for 100 grams of almond flour or a cup of almond flour, you could take out 20 grams of that almond flour or 1/4 cup of the almond flour and replace that with lupin flour. But in reality, any keto recipe, whether it uses almond flour or coconut flour, can be replaced with lupin flour. It's always going to depend on the recipe that you're making, but a rough kind of guide I can give you from my own experimentation. To replace almond flour, it's approximately 60% of the original amount. So if a recipe calls for 100 grams of almond flour, you can use 60 grams of lupin flour instead. This is because lupin flour absorbs more liquid than almond flour, so it isn't a 1-to-1 replacement. To replace coconut flour, it's approximately 200% of the original amount. So if a recipe calls for 100 grams of coconut flour, you use 200 grams of lupin flour. And this is because whilst lupin flour absorbs more liquid than almond flour, coconut flour absorbs more liquid than both of them by a huge stretch. You might have to combat the bitter taste of lupin depending on how much you use in a recipe. It doesn't matter what brand you get. It doesn't matter whether you get sweet or yellow lupin. There will always be some bitterness if you're using a lot of lupin flour in your recipes. But to combat it, it's relatively easy. I just use like a tablespoon of sweetener or a few drops of stevia extract, or even some flavoring sometimes just does the job easily. Now, lupin alone in a recipe will create recipes that are denser, that have a stronger earthy taste and are higher in protein. I would suggest that unless you like recipes like that, you don't fully replace other keto flours with Lupin flour in a recipe. Experiment a little bit. It can be quite costly, but it is definitely worth it. And the best way to experiment is to try and replace other keto flours in recipes with Lupin flour in increments. And I'm going to show you what I mean with some recipes that I made earlier. So I have taken Keto Connect's Best Keto Bread. I've halved the ingredient quantity and I've made 5 breads. For each of the recipes, I've taken away some of the almond flour and added some Lupin flour. And all recipes have the exact same method that goes more or less like this. The oven goes on, I separate the eggs, I combine the flours or flour and baking powder. I add a little sprinkle of cream of tartar to egg whites and I whisk them into soft peaks. Then I put the butter that is melted and egg yolks in with the flours, as well as a third of the soft peaked egg white. I give that all a really good mix until it's kind of mushy. Then I put in the rest of the egg white, fold it in, pour it into a silicone baking loaf tin and whack it in the oven for exactly 20 minutes. We're going to start with the original Keto Connect bread, which is 100% almond flour. This bread is not usually this flat. It usually comes up to, well, about double this. So I'm going to make the assumption that the reason it's a lot flatter than usual is literally because I have halved the recipe, so it was a lot flatter in the pan because I kept the same size loaf tin. Now this bread has a deep, almost sort of brown golden crust. It has a slight crisp to it, which is more of like a sort of cloud bread crust. When I cut into it, you can see that the middle is fluffy and it's sponge-like. This bread has no smell. And taste-wise, the usual taste I'm used to, which is ever so slight sort of egg white taste, tiny little bit of a buttery taste. To be honest, it doesn't really have a taste. The great thing about this bread, taste-wise, is that the moment you put any kind of ingredient on top of it, hams, cheeses, butters, it is the closest thing I've had to high-carb bread. There's no aftertaste or anything. You can't taste the bread the moment the other ingredients go on top. Absolutely delicious. Even if the rest of the recipes are rubbish, you need to try this one out. Now we move on to a recipe that is 25% Lupin flour and 75% almond flour. You can see that the crust of this one is far more golden, it's got less of a brown colour to it. This bread is actually a lot smoother than the last one. It's still got all those sort of cracks and a couple of bumps, but it is a lot smoother. And interestingly enough, this one out of all of them is the longest. I use the exact same pan. So if you cut into this bread, it was a lot stiffer to cut into. And the inside, as you can see, is a lot more yellow, and it isn't as spongy, but it still has some of that nice spongy fluff to it. And taste-wise, that's lovely. There's no bitterness. In fact, you can't really taste much. I would say in this one, I can taste sort of egg a little bit more. It's got this sort of buttery texture to it, a lot more buttery than the last one. I'm pleasantly surprised. I would say I actually prefer this one to the 100% almond flour. And I just want to try it with some butter. This is basically just seeing whether adding something to it masks any unwanted tastes. I would say that's actually closer to high carb bread than the Keto Connect recipe. Wow, that's really interesting. That's just 25% Lupin flour to 75% almond flour of the original recipe. All right, next one is 50-50, 50% almond flour, 50% Lupin flour. So the crust of this one, again, is golden browny, a little bit darker than the last one. It has this hard but soft crust. Now this one, as you can see, is a lot more bumpy. There's a lot more waves to it. It's got those cracks, and this is because obviously Lupin flour being more absorbent than almond flour, the more Lupin flour that goes in, the less water content there is, so it's a lot harder to spread evenly, and it's more like a thick sort of brownie batter. This one, again, cutting into, is a lot stiffer than just the last one. It seems to be getting stiffer the more Lupin flour goes in. The inside is a lot more yellow. Again, it's not very fluffy. It's quite rigid. It has got a little tiny bit of fluff to it, but not anywhere near as much as the first recipe. Taste-wise, tough, dry. You get a hint of bitterness. It's not anything overpowering. And again, it doesn't really taste of anything. There's that slight bitterness. Can't taste egg whites at all anymore. Can't taste any egg. It's nice with butter on it, but it's still very dry. Next up we have 75% lupin flour, 25% almond flour. And this is when they really start to change in shape and size. So the crust of this one is more yellow. You can see it is super uneven, very bobbly and messy. There's not so many sort of cracks in this one, but there is a lot of just up, down, up, down. The crust is harder than the last few, but it's still sort of quite soft. Cutting through this one was horrible. It's like polystyrene. It's really firm to get through, and it makes that squeaking sound. Inside is very buttery in colour, very, very yellow. You can see there's less air pockets in it now. It does have still just that tiny little bit of sponge, but I can feel this one's probably going to be very, very dry. Taste-wise, much, much drier. It's got this protein taste to it. I don't know how to describe it, but there are some foods that you know, like if you buy like a high protein cookie or something like that, you know it's high protein because it's got this very distinct, tough protein taste. After a couple of seconds, you get this soybean taste. It's not like overpowering. Again though, it's not horrendously bitter. I can troop through it. It was just a bit of a shock. Adding butter to it was really nice for the first chew. Then suddenly it went really bitter, and then immediately afterwards went really salty, because I've got salted butter here. And lastly, we have the 100% Lupin Flour bread. Oh, pardon me. Oh, that last one's hit me hard. This one, and this one only, has half a tablespoon of erythritol, the sweetener, in it to try and counterbalance any potential bitterness. I say any potential, after having the 75% lupin flour, there's going to be bitterness. So the crust of this one is like a combination of sort of brown and yellow. It has the hardest crust of them all, and you can see that it is very messy, very uneven, very lumpy, bumpy. Inside, which doesn't look like it due to my lighting, is actually less yellow. There is barely any sponge feeling to it. It is really quite dense. It's actually the kind of density that is putting my teeth on edge, in the same way that somebody that takes off like winter gloves with their teeth, that same sort of it's not nice to squeeze. It's squeaky. It smells like tofu. Taste wise, oh my god, that is bitter. It tastes like bitter dog food. Does butter make it any better? The salt from the butter punches like you wouldn't believe it. My favourite, including Keto Connect's bread, is probably the 25% lupin flour one. I really like that. I'm really impressed with it, which kind of just reiterates what I said, that the best place to start is about 20% replacement of whatever flour you're using to lupin flour. And 25%, that's beautiful. Now, please remember, you can absolutely make sweet lupin flour recipes. I've just gone with a recipe that I know very well. I already have a few lupin recipes on the channel, and I'll link them at the end of this video and in the description down below. And I'm gonna just keep experimenting with lupin flour, especially because I've got this massive bag, and just keep getting recipes out to you guys as and when they are perfected. And if you find yourself getting creative with lupin flour, let me know how it went, whether you liked it. You can tag me on my Instagram, on my Twitter. I'm active on both of them. I really want to get this ball rolling with lupin recipes, because it is fantastic stuff when used correctly. And with that being said, that is all for this video. Leave it a like if you found it interesting, insightful or helpful. Subscribe for more keto content. Any questions, any comments, any queries, anything down below. Keep calm, keto on. Thanks for watching.